Good afternoon and welcome back. We're here for our final keynote session. Our speaker this afternoon for the keynote is Quentin Wodon. As we've been proposing, he'll speak for 40 to 45 minutes. There will be a little pause then and invite you to talk in small groups and then raise for him any questions and things that you would like him to pursue further. So let me introduce him. Specialist and manager of a unit on faith and development. Today he works as the director of the International Institute for Capacity Building in Africa under the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. Another thing I learned about him is that in 2020, he launched the Global Catholic Education Project, an effort to provide resources on Catholic education and integral human development. He comes to us from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to address our topic, education and integral human development and faith, challenges and opportunities. Please welcome Quentin Wodon.
Thank you for this very nice introduction. And thank you all for still being here. It's the last part of the 3-day workshop after lunch. So I have about 40-45 minutes. There's a little disclaimer there in red. Anything that I say does not represent the opinions of my employer, UNESCO, or the International Institute for Capacity Building in Africa. So, I mean, when I was asked to come here, so I thought, yes, I mean, this is very interesting because the topic of poverty has been at the core of what I've tried to do, and tried is the right word, over the last 25 years or so. In thinking about this presentation, I mean, I put it together this morning because I wanted to have a feel for the audience. And I thought I would give you 3 vignettes. One about Joseph Rosinski, who is the founder of an organization I joined quite a few years ago after I left the marketing department of Procter & Gamble. And that's an organization that also works to fight extreme poverty. The title of my presentation is Education and Integral Human Development. And my second vignette is an example of the type of work, some of which I used to do at the World Bank, now some of which I do at UNESCO, just to give you some numbers and facts and empirical data on the importance of education for many other areas. And then this is DePaul University. This is a conference about how the church can serve the poor in many ways. And I'm going to share with you a little bit of data on the Catholic Church footprint over the world in different areas. I'll spend about 90% of my time, I think, on those 3 vignettes, but then I'll make 2 or 3 suggestions afterwards. And to me, and I think it's probably the same to you, those conferences or those events, they're very nice and we learn a lot, but they matter only to the extent that something happens afterwards. And so I'm going to make a few suggestions and maybe there might be some areas of collaboration. So let's start. I used to be working in business for Procter & Gamble, and indeed I left the business world to work for a non-profit. And frankly, you cannot hear me? I have to speak louder? I will try to speak louder. And if you learn anything from my presentation today, this is probably the most important part. Who among you has heard about Joseph Rosinski? Has anybody of you ever heard? One, because you are from France. Okay. So Joseph Rosinski, I never met him, but I joined his organization, and the ideas that he promoted have had a lot of influence on what I did with my life. And I should say that I've never managed to actually do a good synthesis between what I learned when working for his nonprofit and what I've done afterwards in international development. And I think that there is that tension between the type of work that you might do at the grassroots level and the type of work that may have an influence on decision makers at the policy level. And that's why I asked one or two questions earlier this morning. But he was a Catholic priest, and he was born himself in extreme poverty. What's interesting is that he created an organization that is called the International Movement 84th World. That was not a Catholic organization on purpose. He always felt that people from all walks of life could help the poor, and on purpose, he did an interconfessional organization. Now, this is a picture of a shanty town that was nearby Paris in 1957, where his bishop sent him, and that's where he created that organization with about 250 families that lived there in those barracks. And somebody mentioned, I think it was from Indonesia, the type of roof that they had this morning, and where the rain makes a lot of noise, it's very uncomfortable. That's the kind of roof that people lived for years and years and years in those barracks. Normally, I don't show text in PowerPoints because I think that it's sometimes difficult to read, but I'll make an exception for his definition of extreme poverty. And I know that you had a whole session about what is poverty, what is extreme poverty, that I missed in the first day. But let me read this because I think it helps figure out how he saw this. A lack of basic security is the absence of one or more factors that enable individuals and families to assume basic responsibilities and enjoy fundamental rights. Such a situation may become more extended and lead to more serious and permanent consequences. Extreme poverty results when the lack of basic security simultaneously affects several aspects of people's life, when it is prolonged, and when it severely compromises people's chances of regaining their rights and reassuming their responsibilities in the foreseeable future. So that's how he conceptualized extreme poverty. And you have different elements there. You have the concept of basic security, right? And you can have lack of employment. When we talk about homelessness, you can have lack of healthcare, lots of things, and they typically interact with each other. He thought of extreme poverty as a chronic condition. You can actually be extreme poor for a short period of time, but many people in extreme poverty have been in extreme poverty for a long time, often for generations. And what he basically emphasizes is that when you have those lacks of basic securities, that prevents you from exercising your responsibilities. And the one that hurt the poor the most, in his experience, was the fact that in France, but in many other countries, the children were taken away and placed in foster care because the parents could not provide for them. And that's an inability to exercise your responsibilities. And that in turn prevented the very poor from having their human rights real, if you will, right? Now, if there is any one word in this that I think for Rosinski was the most important, it is not the concept of rights, even though he made a lot of presentations at the UN on human rights. It is not even the concept of basic securities that are lacking. It is the concept of responsibility. And the fact that the poor were not able, or the extreme poor were not able to exercise their responsibilities. And that then led to social exclusion and even shame. I mean, he used to say that the very poor were often suffering the most from that social exclusion and sentences like, well, other people treat us as dogs, and things like that, right? It's the inability to exercise your responsibility that hurts the most. And what that means is that the interventions then have to try to enable the very poor to manage to exercise their responsibilities. This is a picture of Rosinski at the Economic and Social Council in France, where he presented that report that was fairly influential there. Now, there have been a few other pieces of work done in more recent years. I just want to mention a few by his organization. I mean, he died in 1987. It's a small booklet. It's called The Hidden Dimensions of Poverty. And it was done by the Fourth World together with the University of Oxford. And I'm not going to go through the concepts there, but it is that whole fact that from a lived experience point of view, extreme poverty is not about a lack of income. It's much more profound than that. And then they go into various dimensions, and that's why it's called the hidden dimensions, right? And that's a 30 or 40-page booklet. It's available online. It's very interesting. Now, this is something that was done about 20, 30 years ago. And I've always been struck by it. Jonah Rosenfeld was an ally person, meaning not a staff, but somebody who was working with the organization. He's a professor in Israel. And he wrote that little book on what are indicators of success when you try to fight extreme poverty. And you will see nowhere there mention of indicators like the ones we use, income. By the way, I worked for 24 years at the World Bank. I think income-based or consumption-based measurement of poverty is very useful. It's indispensable, but there is more to it, right? This is actually a little bit of a chronology from the observation by Jonah Rosenfeld of the work of the organizations in many places of poverty around the world. The first indicators of success was for the extreme poor to just be noticed, right? And there are many stories about how the organizations relied on families in poverty to find families who were more in poverty than themselves, right? Who were living, say, under a bridge somewhere, completely excluded from the city or whatever it was. Ability to make contacts with other, giving and taking. The idea, again, of responsibility is that the key indicators of success is when a family or a person in extreme poverty is able to contribute to the community, not only receiving, but also giving back. And list the past for the future. I mean, understanding your own life and what has happened to you, and building on that to try to create a path for the future. Sustaining memories, experience of pain, and not being completely numb to the conditions in which you live, and so on, right? 10 was knowing and voicing. How to help the poor, and that was a theme in this conference, in terms of voicing their experience and sharing their knowledge. And one of the amazing projects of the NGO was called l'Université du Quart-Monde, means the University of the Fourth World, which were meetings where families in extreme poverty and others were discussing many topics, but people being able to voice what their experience was. And then finally, united we stand. So none of these are easy to measure, by the way, but they are real. They are a real process. And in the end, this is what fighting extreme poverty is apart from ensuring that people have the way of making a decent living. Now, another book that I always also found very, very well done by the organization is Artisans of Democracy. And the key idea was to take case studies, and they have 12 case studies. There is a school, there is EDF in France, which is the electric company. There is firms, I mean, all kinds of different case studies. A church, actually, as well, right? And the key question was, how do we make sure that we go from a situation at the beginning where the very poor are shut out of the institution, and the institution is shut up inside, right? I mean, basically there is no contact, right? And the poor have typically lost any hope that the institution can do something for them, right? And although it is often the mission of the institution to do something for them, right? There's always a difference between the language and the reality. And then at the end, the arrival was not that there was a solution necessarily, but that at least there was a dialogue between the extreme poor and the institution. And they explain how this goes first by an initial encounter between the institutions and the very poor. And then somebody in the institutions takes a stand, takes a risk, actually, advocating for the very poor to be better recognized and served by the institution, awakening to citizenships, and then finally daring to become political. I won't go into the details of that, but it's wonderfully described as the process through which, in practice, institutions that have excluded the poor can re-include them. And again, one of the case studies is the church. Finally, and I think that's my last slide about Rosinski. I mean, this is a picture of a stone, which is on the Trocadero Plaza that has been put in many places around the world. There are replicas. And that says, where men are condemned to live in misery, human rights are violated, uniting to enforce them is a sacred duty. One thing on the left here, and I think for many of us who are slightly academically minded, it's an important reminder. He always insisted on the fact that you had three types of knowledge on extreme poverty. You had the academic scientific knowledge, which tends to be very well recognized. You have the life experience of the poor, the knowledge of the poor themselves. And then you have the knowledge which is action-based, right, of those who are working with the very poor. Of course, of the three, the middle one is the least respected. But there is always a very risk, and I'm guilty as well as anybody else, of using the poor for academic and scientific knowledge without recognizing their own knowledge and without recognizing the knowledge of action, right? And so he was very, very strident in trying to ensure that the knowledge of the poor and the knowledge of action were both recognized. So Brzezinski had a lot of influence on what I did. Then whether I managed to do afterwards what you recognize, that's a different story. But I went into international development. And the second vignette that I wanted to share with you, and it's very different, and maybe there is a bit of different things for different tastes here, is an example of the kind of work that I typically do or used to do at the World Bank. And that's related to the title of my presentation, which is Education and Integral Human Development. And what I'm going to do is share a little bit of empirical work on why education really, really, really matters, right? And what I'm going to do is just share with you parts of a presentation I made a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, in Nigeria for a national dialogue on education that we had, and where the government, the ministry, had asked us to focus on the issue of gender inequality in and through education, right? Now, this is very different, but hopefully it will be useful. So when I'm asked to talk about the role of education for development, I often start nowadays with information on what we call the changing wealth of nations. That's actually a project at the World Bank where the World Bank has tried to put a value, an economic value, on different types of sources of wealth for countries. And actually you have three main sources of wealth for a country. You have what is called natural capital, that would be your oil, your forests, natural capital, right? Can be renewable, can be non-renewable. You would have what is called produced capital, and produced capital is actually based on investments, but it could be your factories, could be your roads, things like that. And then you have human capital, and maybe some of you don't like the term human capital, but it's actually very useful, right? Human capital is estimated as the present value, the value today, of the future earnings of the current labor force. So you take everybody who is working, you look how much they will earn until they stop working, and you take the present value, and you have a measure of human capital, right? That doesn't mean that we treat humans only as capital. It just means that you can value that. It turns out that human capital is 2/3 of the wealth of nations, 2/3 of global wealth. And this is data for Nigeria. I don't know how well the colors work, but the second bar there is the amount of human capital. And in the case of Nigeria, Like globally, it's 2/3 of global wealth, right? Now, the reason why that matters is because if you go to policymakers and you want to start to make an investment case for education or other aspects, health care and so on, it's a good starting point because policymakers pay attention to this, right? The assets that a country has is what enables it to produce GDP, to produce income, and for people to make a livelihood. People are the biggest assets that any country has. And then there's a little bit of other things here about gender inequality. You can show that in many countries, women make, on average, about 2/3 of what men make. In Nigeria, it's less. And then you can make an argument that it's very important to invest in women, and starting with adolescent girls, to try to increase the wealth of the country, which will increase standards of living, reduce poverty, etc. Now, I did a study at the World Bank about the benefits from girls' education. And I just want to mention very quickly some of those benefits. One is that if you are better educated, whether you're a man or a woman, you're going to earn more in adulthood, and that is going to reduce the risk of poverty. But there is also a large impact of girls' education on the reduction of child marriage, marrying before the age of 18, and the reduction of early childbearing, having a first child before the age of 18, and I'll come back to that. There is a large effect on fertility and population growth. Now, sometimes there's a discourse in the Catholic Church that religious women have as many babies as they want, of course. But what you want to enable is women to have the number of children that they want. And in the developing world, many women, most women, have many more children than what they desire to have, right? And I think that if you provide more agency to women, including through education, they will better manage their fertility, and that can have huge beneficial impacts economically and for the reduction of poverty. And I'll explain that. You also have effects on health, nutrition, and well-being. The children of mothers who are better educated are doing much better. It reduces drastically the risk of under 5 mortality, the risk of under 5 stunting. And under 5 stunting is a measure of malnutrition. It's associated with a loss of earnings of about 1/4 in adulthood. If you have stunted as a child, you're going to earn much less because your brain didn't develop as well in adulthood. Agency and decision-making. I mean, if you educate girls better, you will reduce intimate partner violence within the households, you will increase their decision-making power, etc. And the last one, I found that very interesting, social capital and institutions. I've done a few papers on different aspects of that. And it's amazing how higher education, right, correlates with more altruistic behaviors, right? What you have is that people who are better educated are more likely to give money to charity. They have more money. They're more likely to be able to volunteer. They're even more likely to treat or welcome strangers more. That doesn't mean in any way that people who are better educated are more altruistic. Of course not, right? I mean, it just means that they are in a position in their life where they can demonstrate those behaviors to help others. And again, remember, when I started with Rosinski and I said one of the key aspects of extreme poverty is the inability to exercise your responsibilities, and to me that's a case there. The very poor, because of the situations in which they are less able, for example, often to welcome strangers, are less able, of course, to give money to charity, even though they give more proportionately. And they are also less able to volunteer. They just all work all the time, essentially, right? It's again a form of deprivation. Anyway, this was a framework, and I'll just show you a few pictures for Nigeria. I mean, just as a very quick way. I mean, these are just rates of completion of primary, secondary at the lower and upper level, and then how that is split geographically. The basic point of that graph when I showed it was to say there is progress in Nigeria, but the progress is limited. It's the same story almost everywhere, right? Meaning that you have higher completion rates in the latest survey versus the previous survey, but you don't have large gains. And the same story here for child marriage. You have a small reduction between the 2 points of data, it's 5 years interval, in child marriage, but it remains extremely high. And of course, if you see the map, you see the colors reversing, and I'll explain that. There's a very strong relationship between educating girls, preventing child marriage, and preventing early childbearing. The third one is childbearing. It's the same story as child marriage. Small reduction over time, in the prevalence of early childbearing, having a child before 18. I know I'm going very quickly, but you can get the presentation afterwards. Now, what I find interesting, and this was so strong in Nigeria, I couldn't actually believe it when I graphed it, is the relationship between child marriage and girls' education, and between child marriage and early childbearing, right? These are state-level estimates, and this is not a regression, it's just a trend line, right? But the trend line that you have between states on the left shows that essentially, if you believe those univariate trend lines, the changes in child marriage explain 90% of the changes in rates of secondary school completion at the lower level, right? And here you have child marriage and early childbearing, and again, the R square is 85%. What that means is that 85% of the variation in early childbearing, having a first child before the age of 18, is explained by variations across states in the rates of child marriage. That's not any causal proof, but we did much more causal analysis to the extent it's feasible. And what you can say is that the best way to reduce child marriage is actually to keep the girls in schools, and the best way to reduce early childbearing, early pregnancies, if you will, is to avoid child marriage in a country like Nigeria, because the cases of childbearing outside of marriage are so stigmatized that they are not that frequent, right? So again, it's an importance of investing in girls' education here. And this is just one last example on fertility, right? If you look at the impact of better educating girls and reducing child marriage on fertility, you would reduce fertility rate by 1/5 in Nigeria. Why does that matter? And this is just providing education and delaying marriage so that the girls can have the first child when they are ready to have a first child and not at 15 or 16. Why does that matter? Because from an economic point of view, if you reduce fertility in those countries with very high levels of population growth, and that's the top trend line there on the left, it has not budged that much, even though fertility rates have decreased. If you do manage to do that, then you have a demographic transition, and you may have what is called a demographic dividend, which has huge benefit for standards of living and for reducing poverty, right? And it's just enabling women to have the number of children that they want. The last slide here is about under 5 mortality and under 5 stunting. And again, this is actually based on detailed regression analysis, where we look at the impact of the mother's education, as well as whether the child was born of a mother younger than 18 when the child was born, and what that has as an effect, controlling for many other things, on the risk of dying by age 5 and the risk of being stunted by age 5. And you can see here, I won't go into the details, but that you would reduce under 5 mortality by about 1/4 just by educating girls to the secondary level and preventing child marriage. So it has huge benefits across the board. And I focused on girls because the issue of girls' education intersects with the issue of marriage in many of those countries and having a child too early. For boys, you have the same benefits, but some less, because they're not the one giving birth, right, essentially. So this is an example of work that I do every day, if you will, to make investment cases, right? In this case, to better educate girls and reduce in that way the risk of the prevalence of child marriage and so on. Now, what is very important is that this is what you would call in the jargon a cost of inaction study. So it is saying, if you don't manage to deal with this, you'll have lots of negative consequences, right? Cost of inaction, right? And that goes up to a certain way to try to get policymakers to pay attention to an issue. What you need to do next is actually demonstrate that specific interventions that you may want to implement actually are going to give you the results that you want at a reasonable cost, right? That's a benefit cost analysis, and that's an investment case, as opposed to just saying, if you don't do anything, it won't be great, right? And I just want to show 1 or 2 slides about that. Something that I'm trying to make a broader argument on in the next few months. When I started to do work on those issues of educating girls, preventing child marriage, preventing early childbearing, as anybody would, I looked at the literature and what does the literature say about what actually works, right? And what the literature says about what actually works is essentially at the upper secondary level that you need to provide economic incentive for the girls to remain in school so that then they don't get married and then they don't have a child too early. That's what the literature says, right? And what works best is the economic incentives. You have to do other things too, but that's what literature says. And now I'm actually convinced that there's a little bit of a problem with that argument, and I want to share with you that problem. Is that in many of those countries, if you look at the girls who are in upper secondary, right, that's 15% of the girls, 20% of the girls. All of the other girls have dropped out by that time, right? And for those 15% of the girls, I think what the literature says is correct. You need to try to make sure that they stay in school, right? And for a bunch of reasons, and we can go into the social norms discussion if you want afterwards. But the issue is that you're dealing with 15, 20% of the girls, right? When you look at primary, you're dealing with 80, 90% of the girls at that stage, right? And what you can do there is to improve learning in primary school, and that will get more girls to go through the system, and you will have more than 15% at the upper secondary level. And it's actually cheaper, and it's actually more important. And these are data here about Niger. And in Niger, the Hausa communities are very similar to the Hausa communities in the north of Nigeria, right? It's the same kind of groups, essentially. And what the parents tell us is that the main reason in different surveys for dropping out is a lack of learning, right? The lack of learning in school. That's why the children drop out, boys and girls, the same thing, right? And when you go for qualitative focus groups, and I love focus groups, I think also that focus groups are sometimes a bit too extractive. And this work actually comes from somebody I admire who spends months in villages. It's ethnographic work. So they really live there and then they understand much better what happens than when you have a team, focus groups, then we go back and we publish our work, right? So it's the same thing that came out very strongly. Now, many of you are working in Catholic education, right? So let me be a bit more provocative here, right? There's that whole discourse that Catholic schools are better or students perform better, right, than in other schools. If you look at the literature on the US, it's very mixed, actually. I mean, there is slightly more studies saying that is the case, but there's a lot of studies saying it's not the case, right? One of the pieces of work that I did recently was on Uganda. And the data set was very interesting because you could see differences between Catholic and non-Catholic schools and between public and private schools. Right? And what's interesting is that in Africa, and I'll talk to that a bit later, most of the Catholic schools are public schools, they're not private schools. Right? And what you could see in Uganda, again through detailed regression analysis, is that private schools at the primary level were doing better than public schools. Catholic schools that were public were not doing better than Catholic schools that were that other public schools that were not Catholic, right? And Catholic private schools were not doing better than non-Catholic private schools, right? So we have to be extremely careful when we say that Catholic education performs better, right? The evidence is not that clear. But if Catholic and other schools were performing better at the primary level on foundational skills, that would then lead to much more success, and that would probably be a stronger intervention than what we can do at the upper secondary level when economic incentives matters, right? But there's a lot of progress that has to be made in Catholic as well as other Catholic schools. Have you learned about the concept of learning poverty? Who has learned the concept of learning poverty? Okay, so learning poverty is defined, that's a new concept that the World Bank introduced about 4 or 5 years ago, as the likelihood that a child who is 10 years old is able to read and understand a simple text that is age appropriate. What's the level of learning poverty in Africa? 9 out of 10 children today. 9 out of 10 children who are 10 years old are not able to read and understand a basic text. It will be exactly the same proportion, or almost the same in Catholic versus other schools, right? We should not assume in any way, a priori, that Catholic schools do better. Again, I'm insisting too much, but I want to try to debunk a little bit here a myth and to show the magnitude of the issue of lack of learning and what we have to do to invest in teacher professional developments and other things to improve learning. So I just want to spend 2 minutes on this. Hopefully I still have the time. On one of the programs that I found extraordinary. It's not a cheap program, so it's not necessarily the best program to implement in all the contexts. But this was done in Nigeria, and you probably have heard about the concept of safe space. I mean, that's also used actually sometimes in the US as well. And it is a place where the girls, the adolescent girls, can talk among themselves with female mentors about different issues, sexual and reproductive health, life skills, other things. And what happened in that program is that they were very, very intentional in trying to understand what the community wanted, right? And what the community wanted, they wanted the safe space, but they wanted the safe space to discuss what you typically have there, plus have additional instruction in numeracy, in literacy, and so on, so that the girls would actually succeed, right? And they had an amazing success. I mean, essentially, it went from less than 20% of the girls graduating primary to more than 80%. And they're doing right now a randomized controlled trial to see how to build on that. But it really built on the parents' aspiration and again, the idea of strengthening the foundational skills. Now, I'm going to pass on that to save a bit of time. So I told you that I would give you 3 completely different vignettes, right? I mean, my hope is that at least one of the vignettes speaks to each of you, right? I started with Rosinski and how I think that his work is truly inspirational. And by the way, I mean, he's French, right? He was Polish, but then he lived in France. So he knew Saint-Vincent de Paul and all of that very, very well. We went through girls' education and integral human development, and now I want to go a little bit with data on the footprint of the Catholic Church globally. Do you know, I mean, how many schools or how many health centers and social protection facilities the Church has over the world? Or have you ever seen those kind of figures? 10 minutes I have left, right? So I'll try to go fast on that and then go to the suggestions. Now, so this is data on the number of students, right? What you have on the horizontal axis is the time, and then you have the number of students. And you see a very different story between basic education and tertiary education. The graph on the left is basic education. And you can see that basically almost all of the growth, right, in the number of students enrolled in Catholic preschools, primary schools, secondary schools in the world comes from the blue, Africa. That's where there is growth, right? And that's going to continue for the foreseeable future because of population growth and because of higher educational attainment. Look here for universities, right? It's growing fast in percentage rate, but it's still extremely small. And basically all of the students, or most of the students in universities, Catholic universities, are in upper middle income and high-income countries. Even though this is more by region, you can do the same thing by type of country, right? I'll pass on that. If you look at healthcare, this is still schools, so I'll pass on that. This is the number of schools as opposed to the number of students. But if you look at healthcare, there's actually 2 things which are interesting, I find, right? This is the number of hospitals on the left, the number of health centers, and there are a few other measures afterwards. What you see is that, again, most of the growth is happening in Africa, right? That's where most of the service delivery is taking place, at least the growth, right? You also see something happening here with a decline over time, right? While enrollment in school is still increasing for Catholic education, for the case of health, it's actually starting to decline. And my guess is that the Catholic Church has reached some kind of threshold, although that would warrant a much broader discussion. Here you have the total number of healthcare facilities. You have leprosaries, which is a very small one. But you can see, though, that the role that Africa plays and will play in the future in the service delivery of the Church is growing, even though there might be a tempering in terms of the growth over time, right? And what I found also interesting, and that could be further discussion, is that it's a completely different picture for what I call social protection facilities. These are orphanages, nurseries. I'll go through it quickly. You have centers for matrimonial advice, and we could take it out. Nursing homes, center for the chronically ill or handicapped, and then center for educational re-education. There are issues of data, and the last one is the total. But you can see here that there is very little in Africa in terms of what the church is doing. And I found those things very interesting, right? So what you can say in terms of whether the church reaches the poor is two things, right? First, for education and for health, over time, the presence of the church is getting much stronger in low-income and lower-middle-income countries, right, as opposed to higher-income countries. For social protection, that's not the case at all, for all of the other services, right? Now, if you look within the countries, and there are a range of data sets, and I will have to say that very quickly because I guess I have 5 minutes left, right? Does the church reach the poor more than other types of schools or health centers and so on? You might think yes, no. The answer is no. The answer is no, right? What you have is that typically public facilities reach the poor more than church facilities, but church facilities reach the poor more than private secular facilities. So it's a little bit in between there. If you ask another question, right, which is often claimed, when the church invests in new facilities, a new school, a new health center, a new whatever it is it primarily in poor areas? The answer is no, it is not. It is not. And that I could demonstrate with various case studies. So we have to be extremely careful about the language that is often used, that the church reaches primarily the poor. Not necessarily, right? But the church is much more strong, and the importance of low-income countries and lower middle-income countries, at least for education and health, is there, and the church is present there. Now, that might be very different for different families, right? The Vincentians versus others, right? And I'm not discounting that. But I think it's very important to not assume that the church serves primarily the poor, or that in the countries where it is, the beneficiaries tend to be the poor. Not necessarily, right? So, do we reach the poor with quality services? I don't have the time to go there, but in many ways, the work I've done, and that was part of my volunteer work, this is not UNESCO work, it was not World Bank work when I was at the World Bank. What I tried to do is to make a double argument. I will talk about that double argument very quickly before suggesting in 3 minutes 3 specific ideas. So my first argument is that there is a need for the international community, and that was my question about the UN. There's a need for the international community to learn more from the experience of faith-based organizations, including the Catholic Church, in what they are doing on the ground, because I think there are lots of very interesting things happening. And in the case of education, Fe Alegria, which you must know, right, from Latin America is a very good example, right? And I think that it goes beyond, if I may say, advocating for taking homelessness, which is great, right? It has to be very detailed analysis, case studies, quasi-experimental evaluations, showing what actually worked in what the Catholic Church or an Islamic school or Protestant schools did, and that actually worked, right? It has to go beyond the broad advocacy in terms of what works, what is cost-effective as well, because it's very important to be cost-effective, right? So there is that. But there is also a need for the institutions in the Catholic Church, whether it's schools or health centers and so on, to learn from the international community, because right now the links are very, very weak, right? I am convinced that, say, the networks of schools in the DRC, we have a colleague from the DRC, I don't know where he is, they don't have typically access to the experience of the international community about how to make schools better in the DRC, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So there has to be also a willingness of the world of Catholic education and Catholic healthcare and so on to learn from that international experience to what works and what works in a cost-effective way. And we have a long way to go. So that's essentially my key messages. Now I want to go for 3 very specific opportunities that I wanted to mention to you. One is that as part of my first argument, right, when I finalized saying there is a need for the international community to learn from the experience of the Catholic Church and other faith-based organizations on the ground, there are opportunities. One of them is in education, what is called the Global Education Monitoring Report, and every year it's on a different topic, right? This year is going to be about leadership, right? So what kind of experiences do we have that we can write up in a detailed way about good practices of leadership in Catholic schools that could inform that report. They would like to know, and we can provide things, right? Background papers or whatever it is, right? Teachers and good practices and motivation, right? What I find often interesting in some Catholic schools, not all Catholic schools, is the fact that you have often a strong intrinsic motivation, right, of the teachers. And maybe, in some ways, stronger than elsewhere. In the US, as you probably know, teachers are paid in Catholic schools less than they are paid in public schools, right? And they stay. So what is it? It might be the faith, but it might be something else, right? I actually believe it has to be probably with the overall culture, right? And perhaps the way the schools are managed. It would be wonderful to do actual studies of motivations for teachers in Catholic schools to try to inform also what could happen in other schools. What works to motivate teachers, right? And then the last one I wanted to mention, and I think this is my last slide, I think I must be at the end of my time, is about service learning, right? I came across a few months ago with CLIAS. Have you ever heard about CLIAS? No, so service learning, you know the concept, right? Because it's actually not a concept that comes from the Catholic world, right? It's a concept that came earlier from public schools and public universities in the US, right? But service learning, I think, is a very good fit for Catholic schools and Catholic universities, because it's a way to inculcate the value of service in a non-forceful denominational way. Right? It is not about whether you're Catholic or whether you're Protestant or whether you're something else, right? It's about service. DePaul University actually ranks very high in the US if you look at the rankings. And in the data set that I got from CLIAS, which is a nice center in Latin America, it's funded in part by Porticus, you must know the foundation. They did a benchmarking of, they tried to get all of the Catholic universities in the world. They got about 150. And that's a wonderful data set to try to see institutionally, right? What are different universities doing to try to promote service learning, and is it actually working, right? And there would be the feasibility of doing something specific for DePaul, because I think you have a lot of experiences. So my message here, in all of these three things, is part of my first argument, right? There's a lot that happens on the ground that is actually not communicated well, shared well, so that it could inform policies elsewhere. And to me, that's a huge value that the world of Catholic education, Catholic healthcare, and so on could provide. But, and I'll finish with that, there is a lot that world needs to learn from international experience and be with ears open and willing to accept that often experiences elsewhere might be very relevant for what we need to do in the Catholic organizations. So I had two slides, but I'll pass them on for a brief description of what we're doing at my institute in Africa, but I'm happy to answer questions on that. I hope I didn't go too much above the 10 minutes, but thank you so much.
Very energetic presentation. Can I just from lunch that I did? That was really.
Can I just say, I hope you didn't feel too rushed. If you want to go back and do those final two slides, I think we've got enough time for a good conversation.
Sure, I can do the last two slides. So the two slides are just to briefly introduce what am I doing all day. So I'm the new director of what is called the UNESCO Institute. UNESCO has 9 institutes. One is about physics, which is a bit of a peculiar one. The other 8 are about education. And so the institute that I direct is called the International Institute for Capacity Building in Africa. And the main mission is to improve education policies and specifically teacher policies in Africa. And so we just did a new strategy because ours had expired. And what I tried to do, and you could see from my presentation, my bias, right, is that the Institute was very strong here in capacity enhancement, doing different types of trainings, sometimes for teachers themselves, but most often for the institutions that train the teachers or the ministries. And I thought that we need to do more policy dialogue, and we have a very useful tool to do that, which is called KICS Africa 19, which is funded by the Global Partnership for Education. I can explain more if you want later. But then to do policy dialogue, you need to do research. And not any research, right? Practical research that is actually leading to something that the ministry can actually use, right? That's what I mean by applied research. And so we are revamping our strategy, doing more research, doing more policy dialogue. And the basic idea is that the research is needed, practical research is needed, empirical research to inform policy dialogue. And when you do the policy dialogue in country, like I shared with you something that I presented 2 weeks ago in Nigeria, that's when you can identify the priorities for capacity enhancing. That's just a framework, very simple, but that's what we're trying to do. And in terms of topics, we work a lot on teachers, strengthening professional development and pedagogy. One issue is preventing shortages of teachers in Africa, huge shortages. Schools, training leaders and building sustainable societies. It's just that this refers to the fact that some of the topics that are dear to UNESCO, like education for peace, education for global citizenship, education for sustainable development, you have to train the teachers, but this is something that happens really at the level of schools. And then systems, and I mentioned here budgeting and allocating. The point for a policymaker is not whether something would be beneficial. That's not enough. The point when you have limited budget and huge needs is whether what you are proposing is more cost effective to achieve a certain goal than another proposal, right? You have to go into the budget, you have to go into the costs. But all of this is to improve learners, and I gave you the numbers for learning poverty, which are abysmal, right? It's actually worse than 9 out of 10 right now in Africa because of COVID-19. In many countries, kids were out of school for 2 years, right? You know the damage this has done in the US, but can you imagine the damage in Africa? So these are just some of the areas of focus. And the last message I want to say, and this is back to my thank you slide, is that I'm more than willing to collaborate, right? I believe that it's important for my institute to do some work, part of our work, in collaboration with the faith-based schools in Africa. If I look at my estimates on market share, 1 in 7 children in Africa in primary school is in a Catholic primary school. Most of those are public, right? So it's a big distinction. But so it's completely natural to try to understand the issue faced by those systems, or the Protestants, or the Islamic, and so on. And you have some very specific issues, right, that are peculiar and that need to be taken into account when you design teacher policies. But so thank you, William. This was just 2 slides to explain a bit what we do. And again, my impression when we do those conferences is that it's great to have a nice presentation, but the only thing that matters is whether something different happens afterwards, and that's the collaboration, the practical collaboration afterwards. And I'm all open for that. Thank you.
So we'll please take about 5 to 7 minutes in your local groups here to raise what parts of this would you like Dr. Wodon to address more? What questions come out for you? Welcome you back.
Trying to get our attention.
We have about a half an hour for continued conversation, and so please raise any questions that you have.
So, following the title, Education, Integral Human Development and Faith, I see the role of faith in integral human development, but I'm also concerned for the role that faith and religious experiences have in being an obstacle for the integral human development. I don't know if I'm misinterpreting the data in your map from Nigeria, but I clearly see a religious factor behind the disparity between the North and the South, especially in education. This conference is about the reform of the Catholic Church, precisely to advance other agendas beyond the religious agenda. The agenda set for the Catholic Church by Paul VI, integral human development. The agenda of sustainable development, the agenda of equity, diversity, inclusion. Religions have many times been obstacles for these kind of agendas. My hope, and I said this in a regional conference of the World Parliament of Religions, is that the reform of the Catholic Church, if it's seriously taken, will invite other religions to engage in this kind of conversations. I think what is essential for the world today is the reform of the human religious experience, so that we embrace a global agenda, an ethical agenda beyond our own small beliefs. And I know you have the data, the information, and you know when the religious experience is an obstacle and when the religious experience has been a bridge. And you can expand a little bit on that, considering your own experience, global experience.
Sure. So I think that broadly you're right. There can be a lot of benefit to the religious experience for development, and there can be also cases where certain understandings of the faith can be obstacles to development. I have no problem saying that, right? This is one of the reasons why the relationships between the international community and faith groups is not an easy one. And for a few years, I managed at the World Bank what's called it was called the DDVE program, but it was a program between a dialogue program, if you will, between the World Bank and faith leaders. And I still remember my predecessor, who was Catherine Marshall. You may have heard her name. And she's still trying today to make that bridge, and she's still saying it's difficult because not everything is rosy, right? And whether it's the Catholic Church or some interpretation of Islamic beliefs and so on, can be obstacles, absolutely. So I think then that one thing that can help is to try then to have a dialogue that is at a little bit of deeper level, as opposed to sometimes the slogans, right? I mean, which may be well vested in whatever tradition. Right? And one thing I was, which is not an example about the Catholic Church, but it's an example with the Islamic world. One of the programs that was done by the World Bank in West Africa was called SWEDD, SWEDD. So it is the Sahel Women Empowerment and Demographic Dividend Project. So it's a mouthful. But key aims of the project were to educate girls, reduce child marriage, reduce traditional harmful practices, and so on. And one of the things that they did is organize meetings, or rather than organize, I mean, fund and make them feasible for faith leaders to discuss among themselves what did the Quran say about certain things. And that was done by that famous mosque in Egypt, I forgot the name now. And it was extremely beneficial because these were 1 week, 2 weeks long discussions. And I think they led to a clear understanding by accounts of those participants that, for example, the Quran would not promote early marriage, for example, right? Or would not condone female genital mutilation, etc., etc. But that is something also where, for example, at that time, the World Bank were facilitating those meetings, but of course were not in the meetings, because what would the World Bank have to say about the understanding of the Quran. And same thing for Catholicism. The movement would not be opinionating about the interpretation of the tradition. That's not the role, right? But facilitating those meetings to have those discussions in depth about what is, between quote, a good interpretation and what might not be of the tradition, then yes, right? But on your broader point that faith and religious institutions can be very beneficial and sometimes cannot be, absolutely.
Mr. Salvatrice?
I had a question about the level of assessment or evaluation when you were talking about public schools versus private schools, and the reality of private schools always being able to outperform public schools because private schools have the privilege of being able to say, we won't take you. So if you have students with learning disabilities or truancy issues or behavior problems or parents who aren't invested in their children's education, a private school will always be able to just say, go somewhere else. And a public school will say, come in. So do we know, like, in terms of being able to serve people with learning disabilities, what the disparity then would be?
Right. So let me, before going to disability, let me go to the broader issues, right? So the point I wanted to make on citing that little paper I did on Uganda, right, was that Catholic schools, right, should not have a presumption that they are of higher quality than other schools, right? That just doesn't work. It might be the case sometimes, it's not the case other times, right? And now when you do that work, you can do it technically with association studies, which are correlations, so it's regression analysis and so on, which has limited causal power, if you will, but is still, I think, revealing. Or you can do it with experimental data, right? And if you look at the literature on the US on, for example, the benefits of vouchers, right, or the benefits of private versus public schools, I think it's very much debated, but what is very clear is that quite a bit of the higher performance, between quotes, right, of private schools is from sample selection, right? What you described, that they can select the students that they take, right? So the benefits are, so you have to be very careful, and I probably was not when I talked because I was going fast, right? In the paper, it's more carefully said. So you cannot assume that private schools are better, or you cannot assume that Catholic schools are better, and the evidence is very limited. I think that in particular for the issues of learning, as measured through standard test scores and things like that, whether it is a national or international student assessment, I think the differences are much lower than people believe, right? On some other aspects, the differences may be a bit larger, but that's a broader discussion. Now on disability, I think that, again, you cannot assume, right? I did a paper 10 years ago with data from Ghana suggesting that actually religious schools were welcoming more children with disabilities, right? And I would like to test that again. But again, I mean, even when you have those differences, they might not be that large, right? What I find more fruitful than the discussion of who is doing better than who is actually what can you learn from whom, right? Because we discussed yesterday from Latin America, right? And I was looking at you when I was mentioning Fe Alegria, right? I think Fe Alegria has very nice mentoring programs for teachers. That's what I understand, right? From a bit of research, again, that is 10 years ago, where new teachers are really mentored by older teachers, not only about the pedagogy, but also the values of the schools and so on. And I think that has helped Fe Alegria do relatively well, right? And that's what I find the most useful is how do we have experiences that are in Catholic schools or Catholic healthcare, whatever it is, right? That are interesting and applicable elsewhere, right? And vice versa. What is public schools doing that is valid for Catholic schools? Even the concept of service learning, right? People now may think, well, service learning fits the Catholic ethos. Yes, it does, right? It didn't come from Catholic schools or universities. It came from the public sector, right? But Catholic universities have adopted it. And if you look at some of the measures that exist, Catholic universities do very well in that, but it doesn't come from them. They took it from elsewhere, and that's what I find the most interesting. What can you learn from each other, right? As opposed to, are we a little bit better, or are they a little bit better? And those little bit better tend to be not very large in any case. Does that make sense?
Yes, Father.
I would like to thank you, Quentin Wodon, for the. What I like is that your comment at the end that what should be done after this conference. I teach also in the Islamic University, and I teach also in the State University, and also in the Catholic University in Indonesia. So what I observe is this: the Islamic schools or universities, they are indeed very progressive in terms of having international collaboration. What amazed me is that, for instance, the Islamic universities in Indonesia, even they have, let's say, somehow like international collaboration with the Catholic university in Italy, Radboud University in Nijmegen, etc. While the Catholic universities, they don't have such kind of international. So I guess one of the things important to deal with after this conference is, I would say, let's have somehow international collaboration to have the Catholic schools and also universities, well, especially as I observe in Indonesia.
Thank you.
Yes, I need a translator. Maybe you? Just me? Yeah. A propósito de los indicadores, porque una educación cristiana, los resultados pueden ser distintos los que uno puede esperar de una educación pública o no. Entonces, ¿qué es lo que mide una educación cristiana de calidad?
So when you're looking at the indicators, the indicators for Catholic education or a Christian education are very different from the ones for an education. Because they are related to values. So what are the criteria of success of a Christian education?
¿Qué tipo de persona esperamos nosotros formar en la institución religiosa? Porque a nosotros no nos basta que haya personas que tengan un estándar de este tipo. ¿Cuáles son los estándares nuestros?
Yo puedo entenderla, pero para nosotros.
No, for the others. Sorry, the question, so when we're looking at Christian education or faith-based education, there's the question about what kind of people we are educating, what types of people we are producing. So it's not only about the standards or the level of education they reach, there's also the other element that matters more than the academic itself.
So I'll answer in English, but let me put it this way, to be provocative. So
I provoke you.
So if you look at the last 40 years or so of research, right, that was done on Catholic education in the US, because that's where most of the research was done, right? In terms of comparing the performance of Catholic schools versus other schools, right? 40 years ago, and that starts with work by Coleman and others, right? The assumption and the literature was saying, yes, there is a premium to Catholic education, the kids will do better in the Catholic schools and so on. That has vanished with better econometrics, better technical work. Right? Now you cannot say that. There are some indicators where it appears that Catholic schools in the US are doing slightly better, than other schools, and that has to do with graduation rates for low-income groups, right? And that's important, right? But the broad perception that somehow Catholic schools would be better, systematically almost, than other types of schools, I think that if you look at honest observers of the literature, they will say no, right? Now, today, there may be a perception, right, that Catholic schools or Catholic universities are doing better at the values aspect than the other types of schools. I would bet that in 20, 30 years, when there is better research, that will shrink quite a bit. There might be a differential, right? But not as large as people would think. I think that the assumption that because Catholic education pays a lot of attention to values, right? And Catholic social thought aspects and all of that, that because of that, the people who would go to those schools and universities would be better person or whatever it is, I think that's way far away from what we can actually prove, right? And I would not count on it, right? And now what I find interesting though, right? And that is important, is the continued insistence, right, of Catholic schools or university on those aspects. It doesn't mean that they do better at those aspects. I mean, I would still want to be convinced by hard data, right? But the simple fact on insisting of those is very important, right? So I just want to say that there's no presumption that in any of those areas, Catholic education is better than the others. No, I don't think so. There is no presumption in any way that the students who choose to go to a Catholic or a Protestant university are somehow, in some way, in some aspects, better than the students who go elsewhere. I think this is just wishful thinking, frankly. And I also believe that public schools have very strong values as well. Right? The values defended by public schools are fundamental, right? They are a little bit different, perhaps, but they are fundamental too. And so I think, again, that we don't have to put one versus the other, one is better than the other. I think that's the wrong discussion, right? And I think the actual strong evidence that this would be the case is limited. What I find very interesting, though, is that there are different traditions, there are different ways of doing things, and you can learn from what the others is doing, and that can be beneficial, right? And maybe I'm too strong in my response, but I think it's given the limits and the whole issue of sample selection in the question of who goes where, what is attributable to the school or the university and what happens afterwards is a very complicated thing.
We'll just have Yasmin and then Bill.
My question is about what could happen next. And I'm really sorry that Sister Teresa left, because maybe we could have done a connection very interesting after she heard you. But I understand that this process of collecting data, of analyzing data, of producing research has a cost in terms of time and in terms of the whole process of collecting the data. And I think from my intention experience, that's one of the challenges of taking the time of putting those data together as a Catholic institution and make it available to others and producing that research. So what suggestion would you have for us in terms of that? Because it has a cost. We have to acknowledge it. It takes time, and people don't have necessarily the skills to do it as well. So, and when it has to be done externally, it is perceived as a bit aggressive, a bit. So how do you challenge and overcome those difficulties when you want really to do research and data-based evidence?
Right. So there are different types of research, right? And they have different costs, right? So I am even though I just said to you that when you want to look at those effects, for example, measuring comparable performance and so on, you have to be very careful, and that can require very intensive data collection, right? Quasi-experimental studies or RCTs and so on. That is expensive, right? And there's no doubt about that. But there are lots of other things, I believe, that can be done at very low cost, right? And the examples I was giving at the end, like motivation studies, right? What does that entail? It is trying to do a survey of teachers that can be done online, right? A SurveyMonkey or whatever, and trying to understand in different types of schools how well motivated or not motivated teachers are and what helps for motivation. I think that's fundamental, actually. One thing that I would say, and this is more to DePaul University as an institution, right, is that despite any financial problems that you may have like other American universities, you still have more resources, right? And $10,000 to help a university in Africa to do some work goes a long way, right? And might be feasible. Let me give you one example which has nothing to do with Catholic education per se, but So I'm based in Addis, and we had a delegation from Paris UNESCO headquarters come in, and they had worked with two universities based in Addis Ababa, and one of them is actually it's actually an institute as opposed to named a university, but they train for bachelor and master degrees the students who will then go back to the technical and vocational education and training colleges, right, at the secondary level. And there's only one of those in Ethiopia. And some of their staff will go, or the students will go to the private world, right? And so they did 4 studies, which for DePaul University is a given, right? They did a tracer study to look at how the graduates were faring, right? They did an employer study, what's the demand, right? They did a student study, I mean, how do the students currently enrolled perceive the programs? And they did, finally, a study of the instructors, right? All online simple data collection. That seems like a very simple thing to do, but it's not done in Africa. There are very few universities who do that, right? And DePaul would do that all the time, I would assume, right? Well, too much, perhaps too much. Okay. But this is very important, and I think that if universities in the US were allocating a very small budget, but to support just a few universities, Catholic or not, right, in the developing world to do those things, it would be a tremendous benefit for those universities because they don't do it, right? And they don't have the experience. So maybe that's not a good example, but there are ways of doing research that can help. And on SSVP or others, right? What I would love to see, and I don't know whether that's been done, is case studies of programs with some assessment, even if it's imperfect, of impact, but also importantly, what was the cost of implementation? Because I believe that there is a huge benefit of going through volunteers and so on by reducing costs. And it may also actually increase sustainability, right? And those aspects of what is being implemented are often not taken into account in broader policies, right? And but it's badly documented, right? I mean, there are very few case studies looking at the cost effectiveness of what faith-based organizations do. I believe that they're often very cost effective because they have a lower cost structure. But prove it, right? And then what are the implications of that for broader development policy? That's the interesting question. Otherwise, it always will remain very small.
So if I could follow back on this and take a little bit of what Jorge was saying and a little bit of what Yasmin was saying. Your response to Jorge was that we can't assume that Catholic universities are doing better than public universities. There's no data for that. And that's, I think, absolutely right. We cannot assume that. But Jorge was talking about that the point of a Catholic education should be more than, raising test scores on math or improving income outcomes. The whole idea should be being able to recognize Christ in the other. To give one example of what a Catholic education ought to be forming. And that's something that's not measurable, right? I mean, if that's not what we're about, then we should just forget the whole enterprise, right? That there ought to be something else much deeper that St. Vincent would recognize as being worthy of a Catholic education. But the problem is that that's not measurable, right? So when we do these assessment exercises and try to measure things, they end up being this huge apparatus which excludes the most important things, right? So we go through incredible amounts of assessment exercises, and what they end up being, they end up being oftentimes fruitless, or they just channel us into best practices, which just means what everybody else is doing. And they have this tremendously homogenizing effect, which precisely excludes what Jorge is asking us to do. So when we're talking about integral human development, it's that kind of unmeasurable thing that is often missing.
So can I react to that before? That's an important discussion, but let me react quickly, right? So there are two aspects here that what you said, right? One is what is measurable and what is not measurable. A lot of things are actually measurable if you put your mind to it, right? So whether, for example, people are more engaging in altruistic behavior, right? That's measurable. Whether people have more, even the strength of one's faith and one's religiosity is measurable. There are lots of surveys that measure that. Saying that that is not measurable, I think, is going too far. I think it is measurable. It's imperfectly measurable, of course, right? But it is measurable. But there's a more fundamental point, right? You say that the mission of a Catholic university is to be able to see Christ in others. I'm not so sure, right? 60% of the students in Catholic universities in the US right now are not Catholic, right? It cannot be that the first mission of the Catholic university is that. The first mission of the Catholic university is to provide an education of quality in what the students want. It is not to see Christ in others. Now, you need to provide the opportunity to do that. You need to provide the opportunity to do that. You hope that that would be the case for quite a few students. But for at least 60% of your students right from the bat, that will not be the case. And for the other person that say they're Catholic, this is not the reason why they go to a Catholic university. You can look at the data, right? So I'm not saying it's not important, William. I'm not saying that it's not important, right? But I'm saying that the mission of the Catholic university is broader. And when people pay $43,000 to come to DePaul University per year, that's a sticker price, so practically it's lower, right? There has to be a return on investment, right? And you have to pay attention to what are the reasons why students go to college. Somebody said that people see colleges as a way to get a better standard of living. There's nothing wrong with that. That's not the only mission of college, right? But the first mission is to ensure that people get a decent job that they will be happy with when they graduate, right? The other mission is also important, right? But I just wanted to push back a little bit on that, especially because right now, 60% are Catholic. The 40% that are Catholic, it's at various degrees. And the trend is going to be that the share of the Catholics in Catholic university is going to dwindle, right? So it's complicated. I just wanted to mention some of those.
I mean, it is complicated. One of the reasons it's dwindling is because we don't think that we're offering anything distinctive. We're offering the same thing that everybody else is offering. That would be my response to that.
Let me just check with Karen. Do we have time for one more question, Karen?
Yeah, so I just want to follow up on Bill's question. So in 1942, Jacques Maritain wrote that book, Education at the Crossroads, and asked that the number one question that every education asks is, who is a human person? What values are they pursuing? And what's their notion of society? I think that there is a very important anthropological perspective that I see in the presentation, but which I think you can help to unpack more. And because, particularly in Africa, the question of worldviews, those are things that are also not measurable in terms of what is the hidden cultural grammar that is driving the choices that people make. And sometimes I think because of the deeply religious attachment and loyalties of people in the continent, that we could do a better job of looking at how Muslims, Christians, and even the contestation or contested notions of modernities within the evolution of history in Africa, how can we all bring these things together so that the kids who are being born, this growing continent, can actually realize integral development, however that is framed. But I would rather say human flourishing, cosmic flourishing, so that they can have the ladder of social mobility. What are the obstacles and barriers that you have identified? Because that notion of who is the human person, how we understand history, culture, how then does quantifying that, the data sets that you're using, even even the regression model that is often adopted in terms of what is the constants, what are the variables, how do you put all that together so that these different entities can work together, which is not what is happening today. I mean, Catholic education educate more Muslims in some parts of Africa than Muslims, and they are not going in there to learn more about Jesus Christ. So it's becoming consumer driven more than, that is, consumer driven meaning that follow the money. So I know, for instance, some of the Catholic universities in my home country, most poor people cannot afford to go there. So that's what I mean by consumer driven. So they're providing sometimes for rich people than for poor people, and some of them are not Christians.
So, I mean, there were many things in that question. I don't know if it was a question, right? I mean, let me, and I guess we have to conclude soon, just mention two things. And again, whatever I say here is my own opinions. It doesn't represent my employer, right? So first, one of the things you said, Father Stan, referring to Africa, right, is that in many parts of Africa, Catholic schools and Catholic universities are not for Catholics. I mean, if you go for Gaza, you go for Palestine, you go for all of North Africa, you go for a large part of West Africa, 9 out of 10 children in Catholic schools are Muslim, right? And I think that's great. And the aim of those schools is not to convert at all, right? It is to serve those children and provide the best education they can provide. And indeed, often with an emphasis on values, but not in making them Christian, right? So I think that's very important. And I think that I interviewed many of the national leaders of those networks of Catholic schools in Muslim countries, and they are very clear on what they are doing and what they are not doing. And they think it's very important for Catholic education to be present in those countries, right? So I just want to remind that. And then the other thing I want to finish, if you cannot take any more questions, by an anecdote. This is a school in Burkina Faso. There's a small paper that I can send to those who want it in a journal about what they do. So it's about 60% Christian, it's about 40% Muslim, right? And one of the key questions that the school leader had is, how do I make each of those two groups appreciate the other and support the other? And so there is a committee, I think it's called Bakila, I forgot exactly the name, whereby the Muslim students send message and support the Christian students when it is Easter and so on. And then when it is Ramadan, the Christian talk to the Muslim and support the Muslim to do Ramadan, right? And nobody tries to convert, right? Absolutely not. But then there is that mutual respect that comes out of this, right? And actually a better mutual understanding as well. Now they do a lot of other things which are great, like they have links with the local business world, right? And they have a lot of very innovative practices to prepare students to actually get a job when they come out and so on. But to me, so the mission is to enable the individual to flourish in the way that the individual wants to flourish. And if Catholic universities and Catholic schools can do that, as well as others, and there is no presumption that they will do it better, but that's wonderful. What I find very interesting in the Catholic tradition, but also other faith-based tradition, is a stronger insistence on that and those other aspects that sometimes you find elsewhere, right? But without presumption that you will do it better. But the reminder that you have to focus on that.
So a short stretch break, and we'll continue in 11.